showtime!
You know, I made the C2 list first because C2s can actually be kind of controversial with how strong they can be, and people don't like that sometimes. You know what's funny though? I'm not sure a lot of Raiden C2 owners could even tell you what her C1 does off of memory because they're just interested in the C2, that juicy DPS increase. So once again, I'm here to ask the question of how many C1s are actually broken? Okay, not many C1s are actually broken, but some of them are broken in the context of other C1s. Most of us probably know just looking at this constellation that it is a god-awful constellation. If you want to get this constellation and play main DPS Venti, you go ahead and you have fun with it. I hope you do. Objectively speaking, however, it is a terrible constellation for Venti. The funny part being that if you gave this constellation to Ganyu, you'd have one of the most broken ones in the entire game and could honestly be her C6 and nobody would question it. But on Venti, it's very much not broken. Honestly, one of the worst constellations we have. Klee C1 leaves a lot to be desired in text. I feel like I'm looking at Smash Bros. Patch notes here with a certain chance. The hell does that even mean? Is that 1%? Is that 50%? Is there a cooldown? How long is the cooldown? I don't friggin' know. The constellation doesn't tell us shit. Lucky for us, it has been figured out, and it's got about a 10% chance, and it does increase every time it fails. So it's got like a basically pity system, and apparently has no ICD. So while there aren't exact numbers because it's a little bit RNG on how much it's actually going to increase your DPS, it is considered to be a rather low to middling increase of what you would expect from a typical C1. The value you get out of Child C1 is going to depend entirely on how well you play him, which is fitting because that's a statement that's just true for Child himself as a character. With C1 and proper rotations, you will actually be able to get extra melee attacks in with Child that you wouldn't be able to get in otherwise. Of course, a cooldown reduction like this also has added value in things like the overworld or domains, allowing you to be more flexible. And in some cases where you stay in his melee stance for way too long, I guess you'll shave off quite a bit of cooldown with it. But overall, it's a pretty average constellation. Zhongli C1 is a little bit of an interesting one. In a way, it's an amazing constellation. In other ways, it can be kind of an annoying one. There are a few pros that go along with this constellation. For example, he can activate Tenacity the Millilith easier with AoE coverage. The pillars have rather small AoE, so having a second one on the field just increases the AoE and the chance that you're actually going to proc it on time, which also counts for energy generation. He can't generate from two pillars at once, but having two pillars does increase the chance that one of them is going to be hitting and generating energy. And of course, having another construct available is amazing for Geo Construct DPS comps, or even will just help add a little bit extra damage in mono Geo comps. Now, while these contributions are decent enough, they aren't anything huge. Like, it's not a make or break to have this C1. It's a bit of a personal thing, but it actually kind of annoys me having multiple pillars up at the same time. But overall, this is a decent constellation. Not amazing, but just, you know, it's good enough. Albedo C1 is incredibly comp dependent. In something like Mono Geo with Ito, it's completely useless. This con will do absolutely nothing for you. In a team comp where you're actually using Albedo's burst and relying on the 125 EM that it can offer your party, then actually it's a pretty decent constellation, drastically decreasing the ER requirements that Albedo has. But the fact that in some team comps it's a completely useless constellation just like Venti C1 where it's not actually being used, that makes it a little bit hard to judge because sometimes it's an incredibly useful constellation, sometimes it's an actual useless constellation. But we can say that in no case is it an amazing constellation. It's nothing like the more powerful ones we'll talk about later down the line, like such as Hu Tao, that everyone knows is probably coming. Poor Chalkboy was just not blessed with an amazing constellation tree, but you know what? That makes you feel better when you only own C0. Ganyu C1 offers two things, energy regen and more cryo resistance shred, which is always great, but sometimes it's not exactly required. However, luckily, even if you do play Melt Ganyu and you're not actually using her burst, this will still help you because of the resistance shred. That resistance shred, however, is not always going to be at full value, because if you didn't know, any resistance shred that exceeds 0% is halved. And even though she's almost always paired with an Animo unit with Viridis and Veneer, and it's almost always going to be halved, it is still effective because even half is still good. That still doesn't make this a broken constellation, but it is certainly a decent enough one. Maybe if she struggled with energy more, it would be a better constellation, but right now it's, you know, it's what you would expect from a C1. Xiao C1 is probably one that's overestimated quite a bit. Usually things that add extra charges to skills are pretty good. Due to the cooldown of his skill and the nature of his burst rotation, it just doesn't end up doing a whole lot, and I would recommend you reading up further on it yourself if you don't quite understand why. I'm just not gonna spend 4 minutes of this video parroting the information of smarter people than myself. You can feel free to go down below and tell me how C1 Xiao has changed your life. That's your prerogative, but I'm just gonna say it's a pretty mediocre con. There's really not much I can say about Hu Tao C1 that people don't already know. After all, this is the Raiden C2 of C1s. Beyond being a sizable damage increase, it also just makes her feel more fluid to play. She's more mobile, she dodges more, she's iframing a lot. With being a huge DPS increase for a C1 and being quality of life upgrade, this is just a very strong constellation. Eula's is a very sizable chunk of physical damage increase for doing absolutely nothing different than she would already be doing, which is a nice thing to consider. After all, having a requirement that is a pain in the ass to activate can make something worse, like in the example of Archaic Petra versus something like Noblesse Oblige. So this does make it one of the stronger C1s, but still not quite broken. C1 Kazuha can effectively solo almost everything below floor 11 in this entire game with nothing but repeated use of his skill thanks to high elemental mastery. Now, in practical use, it may not always be wise to actually spam a bunch of skill uses because you may cut into the A4 buff timer in the case of swirling multiple elements at the same time. There's so much more than just DPS to consider here though. There's overworld exploration with the cooldown reduction. There's more CC thanks to more skill uses. I think this constellation just barely deserves to be considered broken in the context of other C1s. It's fun, it adds some damage, it's even got some overworld application. The only thing it's not really doing is appeasing the damage per screenshot people, but you know what? Nobody cares. I can already hear the Ayaka mains just trembling with anticipation, waiting for what I'm going to say. And what I'm going to say is just going to be a purely factual statement that this constellation does not effectively change her rotation at all. Look, as I was recording this, I tried to find even people on the Ayaka mains Reddit to talk positively about this, and people are even crapping on it there. And that is saying something. There are people on the Venti mains Reddit that defend the Venti C1. Mostly memes, but still, they're defending it to some degree. That being said, I do think this is better than Venti's, but it's still crap. Yoimiya's is one of two C1s that I got accidentally, her and Albedo's, and I wasn't excited to get either of them because neither are that good, especially when you're using Shimenawa's and you're not proccing it. While killing an enemy to get the 20% attack may not be a very difficult requirement, it can still be improbable to get on floors with bosses or with two very high HP targets. And the requirement versus reward just makes this a very mediocre con. When Raiden C2 was literally all the rage and it's all people could talk about, no one really mentioned the C2 aside from just taking a little bit of time to shit on it and call it useless, when all it took was a little bit of basic math to see that getting your resolve stacks to max wasn't always going to happen. So this constellation is really just going to help increase your damage on a consistent basis and also just open up team comp flexibility. It also just had the added benefit of helping her synergize even more with C6 Kujosara. That all being said, despite the fact that it was undervalued, it is still nothing insane. It's just a respectable damage increase, once again in line with what you'd expect from a C1, with the little caveat of performing a little bit worse or better depending on what team comp you put her in. I know this one is definitely going to get some pushback, but Kokomi's is just not very good. Much like Venti, this isn't necessarily the way you should be using your Kokomi. If that's how you use her, that's totally fine. Play her for fun, play her how you enjoy her. However, you should be getting all of your healing from her jellyfish and not really be spending any time using her burst for anything other than refreshing its duration. In some comps, this might add some value. In most comps, it's probably not going to do anything for you. Straight up, I have never used C0 Ito outside of his trial, not once, because I activated C2 immediately. And I think his C1 feels amazing. It's honestly hard to imagine not having it because you get to go into a charge attack string right out of bursting and throwing Ushi. But much like how I'm relying on Kachingmei's information for constellations that I've never had, I'm also going to rely on their information for a C0 that I never experienced. And according to their guide, C1 is not actually a large damage increase, but I can tell you it does feel very good to use. That being said, I will trust what they say about the DPS game, but much like Hu Tao, he just feels a lot better to use with it, at least in my opinion. This is the first C1 I accidentally got and was actually happy about, because extra charges, yes please, except when they're on Xiao. And I mean, the skill is her whole appeal. It's basically the reason why she's in the team she's in. This allows her to front load a lot more teams than a cryo quick swappy team, allows her to funnel more energy into something like a Morgana team. Now the DPS number is not a huge increase by any means, but it is team-wide damage because it's a buff for the whole party. On top of doing things like adding more energy regeneration and just more flexibility of use, which overall just makes this constellation pretty solid. Yaimiko's C1 is one of the highest energy refunders in the entire game. This significantly lowers her ER requirements, which as we know can free up more artifact stats and just allow you to gain more damage through artifacts. Sometimes that can be the difference of equipping an ER sans versus equipping an attack sans, which is a huge damage boost. Of course, depending on the team comp, whether you run her with like Raiden or other Electro units in general, the value of this constellation can go up and down, but at its best case use, it is a very strong C1. Ayato's C1 is a little bit hard to quantify, but also pretty reliable at the same time. On one hand, his elemental skill is a vast majority of his damage when he's the main field DPS. However, due to the fact that this requires enemies to be lower than 50% HP, that means on smaller enemies it may not proc, and when it does proc, it may not matter anymore. And on larger enemies like bosses that have a lot of HP, it might be a little bit more consistent. In High Abyss, it'll definitely get some value, but in most content, it's just gonna be okay. In not only my opinion, but also just in raw damage numbers, this is the only competition that Hu Tao really has in this category. Anyone who's used Yulan knows that her elemental skill hits like a truck. And if you didn't know, the few seconds that you're running around in her second charge of her skill, the first one is actually recharging while you're doing that, which is one of the things that makes her just so good at moving around in the overworld. And if you would like to see a video where I compared all of the different overworld movement options on different kinds of characters and character heights, I will link that here and down below. But aside from that overworld quality of life, the actual damage she gains from this is pretty damn significant, and she also gets more energy, which again is extremely important for her. If I was to factor in other things like overworld movement and the fact that her C2 is way better than Hu Tao's, I would rank her better than Hu Tao. However, since we're just talking about the relative strength of C1s, Hu Tao's does win a little bit, but I would say not by much. This one is very simple. A 15% crit rate boost for his charge attacks is pretty damn good, especially considering his charge attacks are a pretty sizable portion of his damage thanks to his elemental skill. However, thanks to its 12-second cooldown, the burst is still a significant portion as well, which does overall lead to just the DPS gain from this being good, but nothing too amazing. This is kind of unknown territory in terms of smarter people than myself doing the math for me. So that means we're just going to go by general attack speed rules. Using Ayato C4 as an example, who gets almost a 15% damage increase from their 15% attack speed, Cyno will not get such benefits because he is not almost entirely pure attack damage like Ayato is. He has quite a bit of skill damage mixed in there as well, so it's not going to be nearly as beneficial. Cyno also unfortunately suffers from hit lag unlike Ayato, so I would have to guess this might be something like in the 8 to 15% increase range just based on other characters. We will find out for sure in time as people do the math, but I think it's safe to say that this is an above average con for a C1. And now the most unknown one, and honestly, I don't know what to say about this one. At first I thought it sounded kind of broken. 6 extra seconds on the pirouette like Hydra Aura sounded amazing, but now that I know you have to choose between that or attacking with her regularly, I'm really not so jazzed about it. And while 65% may be a very high bonus, her raw personal damage is just so low that I can't see that being worth it to get just for that one thing. But since she's so new, I just want to clarify that I think she's a very strong character. I'm impressed by her own power, and her C2 is amazing. I didn't get to comment on that in the last video because she wasn't officially out yet, but her C2 is very, very strong. It's basically a baked-in Viritus and Veneer for free, and normally you can't even VV proc Dendro because it can't swirl. But in any case, that is everybody. No, the standards are not here this time. I'm just not doing it. It's too long already, and most of them suck anyway. But what I want to know down below is, are there any C1s that you have gotten unintentionally, whether it be by back-to-backs or trying to build pity for the next banner, and you just won 50-50 early and you didn't expect it? And are you happy that you got it? Because in most of my cases, I've not been. Thank you as always to my patrons who support me over there. If you would like to become one, links to my socials are down below. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one, which will probably be C4s. I can't wait to shit on some C4s.
Attaboy!